Just a short while from now, Prime Minister is set to address the joint sitting of the House of Congress of the United States. Also joining us now is our correspondent from Washington, D.C. Benji Hyer is with us. Benji, as we talk about Prime Minister's visit to the United States, help us understand this unique honor of being able to address the joint sitting of the House of Congress, and what are the expectations that you're tracking?
Well, it's a good question, because listeners and watchers might not know that this is a rarity. That during the Biden administration, there's only ever been one other world leader, the South Korean president, to have the honor of addressing a joint session of Congress, and only another leader, French President Emmanuel Macron, who's been gifted a state visit and a state dinner, which President Modi will hopefully enjoy in a couple of hours' time. So this is a rare opportunity, and if we're looking back at history and precedents, well, Prime Minister Modi will become the first Indian leader to have the privilege of giving an address to a joint session of Congress on more than one occasion, having done so during a previous US administration. It is during that speech where he will speak of India's future and again highlight the areas in which the US and India are hoping to collaborate in terms of their values, and it'll be well received, I'm sure, by many Republican lawmakers, China hawks, who have been patting Joe Biden on the back for embracing India in America's attempts to counter China's influence in the Indo-Pacific. But a few Democrat Party lawmakers are sitting out, citing concerns over human rights in India, especially religious freedoms and press freedoms as well. After that speech to Congress, there will be, as I said before, that state dinner. President Modi has a full day of activity. Prime Minister Modi, I should say, has a full day of activities ahead of him on Friday here in Washington, D.C., meeting with business leaders and CEOs.
Right, and we've heard from a number of US congressmen across the aisle issuing welcome statements earlier on, and will Shri Thanedar, an Indian American congressman, be accompanying the Prime Minister as he addresses the joint sitting of the US Congress? Can you give us more details on that?
Well, I'm not sure who might be flanking him, but I know that the majority of lawmakers will be present beside those sitting out and deciding not to attend. And of course, Prime Minister Modi will then rejoin with President Biden for his state dinner afterwards. This is a chance, though, to, as I highlighted before, make history, both in terms of the presence of Indian leaders and also global leaders to have been embraced by this US administration. And it's a bold decision, you have to remember, from President Joe Biden. The reason being is that on a number of different fronts, the US and India don't see eye to eye. There had been maybe a divergence of opinions when it comes to treatment of Russia, the US sanctioning Moscow following the invasion of Ukraine more than a year ago. India, on the other hand, buying more oil from Russia since the start of that conflict. But Joe Biden is willing to put that aside, really, even though that is one of his bigger foreign policy issues, and is showering Modi with these trade deals and weapons sales with an intent to have that shared goal of suppressing China's influence in the region and also creating revenue and jobs for the United States as well. Those deals we've seen agreed on General Electric, or the sale of those drones to India, that's going to be financially and politically beneficial to Washington.
Right, Benji. In world of politics, they say body language is a significant indicator from Prime Minister's earlier engagement with former President Donald Trump to his engagement now with President Joe Biden. What is your sense of the leader-to-leader rapport between President Biden and PM Modi?
Well, we didn't see what happened behind closed doors, but the fact that these leaders spent a significant amount of time together during their bilateral meeting, so much so they were pretty much an hour late to that press conference, is actually a good sign. Recently, Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, also from Indian descent, spent a significant amount of time in his meeting with Joe Biden, was late to his press conference, and that was viewed as a success for the UK. The fact that they'd managed to sit down with the president and engage with him for so long, and we saw a similar thing this time, but potentially it was because they were working through disagreements, but an optimist would say that it was because they saw eye to eye on so many issues. They stood side by side at the lecterns. If you're talking about body language, then they seem to embrace each other on that front. But it was interesting to also see how President Joe Biden responded to some of the press criticism of Prime Minister Modi, and was careful to not outwardly condemn New Delhi with his own sort of rhetoric, in the same way that he's, for instance, criticised China of late. And that is a real sign that Joe Biden is prioritising this friendship, as he calls it, with India, that it's more than just a defence or trade partnership, that these two countries genuinely are allies.
Benji, in your career, have you seen the White House being opened to the civilians before? Has it happened before?
Well, yes, but nonetheless, the scale of what we saw when the Prime Minister attended the South Lawn of the White House this morning with hundreds, if not thousands, of members of the Indian diaspora presence, that is not a thing you see very often in Washington, D.C. It's not every day that people just get to walk into the lawns of the White House, especially not on a state visit. Again, that is a clear sign that the US administration here wants to welcome Prime Minister Modi, wants to come across as an ally. It's not to say that this visit hasn't had its critics. A number of Democrat lawmakers have been critical of Prime Minister Modi, and some members of the Indian diaspora here too that I've spoken to. But for the large part, Mr. Modi is a respected man who, despite any controversies back home, ultimately is being welcomed by the administration here, and many of those in attendance during the course of Thursday.
Right, and Benji, a little more on how is the Indian diaspora seen in the United States. We understand that they're educated, they're a significant contributor to the American economy, but as a community, as a body, what is the kind of standing that the Indian diaspora has in the US?
It's hugely growing, not just in terms of numbers, but in political importance as well. It's becoming a growing voter bloc. It's going to have sway in the next general election. Consider the fact that also, from a political representation standpoint, the Indian diaspora has seen themselves represented more and more of late. The Vice President, Kamala Harris, is of Indian descent. There are individuals of Indian descent partaking in the primary process to become the Republican nominee for president to take on Joe Biden, the likes of Nikki Haley, for example, and several other lawmakers as well in Congress from Indian descent. I mean, locally, anecdotally, Washington, D.C. has a thriving Indian community, restaurants here serving people in and outside the community. I think one of my colleagues spoke to you the other day about how an Indian restaurant has been receptive to that. But I think it's worth recognizing especially the impact on a political level of the Indian diaspora here, and perhaps this visit by Prime Minister Modi would have given that a boost, but it comes amid some lawmakers still being very cautious about how the United States is embracing India, given human rights concerns that some congressmen and women might have here.
Benji, after hearing out Prime Minister Narendra Modi, there is going to be a task at hand before the US congressmen, the need to give their nod to the jet engine production deal which is going to happen in India, the co-production under the deal that has been signed between General Electric and the HAL. In the past, we've seen that they have facilitated, in fact, the Indo-US nuclear deal. However, I'm given to understand that the US Congress is, for instance, not very keen on having a free trade agreement with India. So, do you think that this is going to be a smooth ride, the engine deal in the US Congress?
Look, politics in the United States legislature is never a smooth ride. It's a divided government, so you have a Democratic president, Joe Biden, and still at least one of the chambers of Congress, the House of Representatives, controlled by Republicans. So on a number of different fronts, you see disagreements, and countries like the UK have found it very difficult to sign free trade agreements with the United States. The language there was quite promising. I mean, Mr. Modi referred to that General Electric deal, for example, as a landmark agreement that will bring new job opportunities. And I think that will be recognised by many lawmakers who may have otherwise been sceptical. It's not necessarily going to get unanimous backing. It may take time, but there are potentially enough politicians on Joe Biden's side and from the other side of the political spectrum, the Republicans, who would like to see this deal pass because it ticks a number of their boxes, which is economically beneficial to the United States and reinforces America's defense influence on the global stage. That is something that many hawks on the right of politics here actually welcome quite heavily, and so that is going to be favourable to Joe Biden when he looks at the odds of passing any sort of legislation. But you know, that changes as the winds change in the United States, and Congress can be an interesting place, and there are also domestic concerns. You know, the US finds itself in a few months where it might have to have another discussion over the debt ceiling here, which has been a prevailing concern, and so if that preoccupies the minds of lawmakers, then some things might be put on the back burner for a while.
Right. Benji, apart from, of course, engaging with the leadership in the United States, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, you'd also mentioned, has been talking to a lot of business leaders as well, CEOs. He had a meeting with Elon Musk earlier. What is your sense of the manner in which these American businesses now look at the prospect of investing in India? Given that India, the sort of resilience it has shown coming out of the pandemic as well, it continues to be one of the fastest growing large economies. What is the manner in which the business houses and the business leaders have shown interest in engaging with India?
Well, many see it as an opportunity. Elon Musk, the CEO of Tesla, is going to be visiting the country next year, having sat down with Narendra Modi in New York. In Washington, D.C. on Friday, Narendra Modi will address further business leaders and CEOs and members of the Indian diaspora. I don't think this trip has been a plea for investment, but I think that when it's encouraged by the White House, that is certainly going to facilitate the private sector here, thinking that India is a good place to do business, especially when across the world there have been countries that are more hostile towards the US of late, in China and Russia, for instance, and when opportunities fall out of favour in those nations, India is then welcoming its arms to American companies, and that can be a welcome opportunity for those organisations. It's going to matter, obviously, when we see pen put to paper. The likes of General Electric is a deal that is likely to happen. You know, when it comes to Elon Musk or semiconductors, another big part of the industry, there needs to be concrete deals here. But the rhetoric from the administration, the rhetoric from the White House that you see behind me, that sets the tone. And the tone is pro-investment, going both ways.
Right. And in the past, when the Prime Minister addressed the US Congress on the 8th of June 2016, he spoke about how this relationship has overcome the hesitations of the past, referring to the sanctions that were put after the 1998 Pokhran 2 nuclear tests, and beginning with the visit of Bill Clinton after 2000, the trajectory of ties began to change. So, you know, what do you think could happen this time around? I'm not asking you to preempt, but do you expect him to build on the way this relationship has progressed over the past 23 years, particularly, and put out the future trajectory, perhaps?
Well, when it comes to addressing Congress, it's less about specifics and more about tone. I mean, the substance has been dealt with behind closed doors, and there'll be business dealings and further reinforcements of trade relations. When it comes to standing there, it's about being a statesman, ultimately, and coming across as an ally, a strong ally, and it's the language, I think, that's going to be most important for Narendra Modi, as opposed to any sort of firm economic specifics that are going to be laid out. And he will you know, turn back and look at history and look at the previous instances that have been these states addressed, and look how there's been a change of a relationship between the US and India, at least according to New Delhi, for the better. And this is going to be an opportunity for Narendra Modi to lay the groundwork for that future relationship, which could well change under a new US or Indian administration in the future. But for now, Modi and Biden seemingly standing side by side in unison, and this speech in Congress is a way to sell that message almost to lawmakers as well.
Right, and Benji, while this visit, we see the leaders of United States of America and India forging closer ties in defense. I'm curious to learn, how does the American leadership look at India's close ties with Russia as well? I mean, a country where America in many ways is at loggerheads over so many issues, including the Ukraine war, of course.
Well, this is the crux of the dilemma that Joe Biden faces, and he seemed to have made up his mind, which is to put aside any sort of grievances that he has when it comes to India's stance on Russia. As I said before, the US has sanctioned Moscow significantly since the invasion of Ukraine. India, on the other hand, has bought more oil, has gone from hardly purchasing any oil to buying about half of what the country exports by sea. Joe Biden is willing to look past that to what he sees as a greater goal, strengthening the US-India partnership with a collective aim to counter Russia with these trade and defense partnerships. It's a dilemma, and it hasn't sold everyone here in Washington DC, and there are going to be lawmakers that are concerned that the US is siding so strongly with a country that does not see eye to eye when it comes to the war in Ukraine. But Mr. Biden has made a political calculation, and that calculation is that he sees it as a greater benefit, a greater reward economically and politically to stand with Narendra Modi than it does to sideline the Indian leader over New Delhi's relationship with Moscow.
Right, Benji, stay with us. Let's get more ground perspective from